In 1986, there was a Chernobyl accident, and after that, it had many negative impacts on the population and the surrounding environment. Today, I'm joined by experts, and we're going to do a deep dive into this tragedy and what was done afterwards to cover up the reactor and prevent further exposure to radiation. So, firstly, Max, can you tell us a little bit more about who worked on the reactor and what went wrong?
Absolutely. I'd like to talk about the poor communication between engineers and other engineers during this accident. So for example, most engineers that were working the plant during that day had to perform a safety test, and all of them were not informed about the safety test, so they kind of just had to improvise and listen to their superior. And also, most of the engineers that were working in the plant had no idea about the possible reactor's flaws, such as the positive void coefficient that could cause a reactor explosion. So they weren't even aware of the risks of this reactor.
Okay, so communication really is key. Nicholas, what impacts did this accident have on the surrounding population?
Okay, firstly, I want to talk about the immediate impacts on society. So the immediate evacuation. So around 120,000 people had to be evacuated from Pripyat instantly, along with the surrounding regions nearby. Next is the psychological trauma that all the evacuees experienced. So there were families being separated. There was a lot of post-traumatic stress. There was an increased amount of depression, and people passing away. Next is the economic disruption. So people were laid off their jobs instantly, especially agriculture. So they had all their crop destroyed, and so it made them unable to work. Now, I also kind of want to talk about the long-term effects that this had. So there was health concerns. There was excess amount of radiation, which caused an increase in the amount of thyroid cancer cases. And next is also stigmatization. So a lot of the evacuees or people that were nearby were thought of as contaminated, which made it increasingly difficult for them to seek job opportunities, housing, and overall impact in society a lot more difficult.
Since humans aren't in the center of the universe, we should also look at the impacts on the environment. So Morgan, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Immediately after the disaster, radiation killed large areas of vegetation, including the famous red forest. Also, many of the nearby animals, insects, and plants also died shortly after the explosion due to the radiation. And the soil and water also become contaminated with long-lasting radioactive isotopes. Now today, some radiation has faded, but elements like cesium-137 still remain in the environment. Also, certain zones are still unsafe for long-term human life, and some forest fires could have the possibility to re-release radioactive particles into the air.
The photo you're about to see is a picture of the red forest, where you can see it has this very rusty red look, which is the effects of radiation.
A good overview of the incident. Let's see what was done to then cover up the reactor. So there was a sarcophagus that was built on top of the reactor, and many people worked on it. Alice, can you tell us a little bit more about the engineers and non-engineers that worked together on this project?
Yes, in order to build an effective sarcophagus, engineers have to work with many other professions such as construction workers, material scientists, environmental scientists to really determine what's the best structure of the dome, what's the best materials to use, and how it would impact the society and the environment as a greater whole.
So we know the people who actually built that dome were called liquidators. And
In the following image, you can actually see what liquidators look like.
there's about 600,000 of them. Something that went wrong was that a lot of them were not properly communicated about the negative impacts that this project would have on their health, such as they were told that radiation was a myth, and they also weren't explicitly told what amount of radiation that they would have. Okay, finally, Lucas, can you tell us a little bit more about any ethical issues we should be aware of regarding this project?
Yeah, so a large ethical issue related to the construction of the sarcophagus was whether to create a temporary fix and suffer potential accidents in the long term, or create a long-term solution at the risk of releasing more radiation in the short term. And in the end, they picked the short-term emergency solution and built the sarcophagus in only a couple months. But as a result, it was greatly rushed, and many joints and bolts in certain areas were never put there, and there were also unsealed holes in the ceiling, allowing water inside and corrosion to set in. And this eventually took a toll on the building and slowly damaged the internal structure over several years. And any extreme weather event would have put the dome at risk. And only a few decades later, the dome was at risk of collapsing. However, a long-term solution would have risked more radiation leaking initially during the disaster and would have risked more exposure to workers during the construction. Ethically, the best solution would have been to invest in better safety equipment, to implement an emergency response like the sarcophagus, then invest in a follow-up solution that is much more stable and long-term.
Let's have a look at an actual image of what this looked like to have a good understanding of what Lucas was talking about.
Thank you guys all for your time, and this story of Chernobyl is a powerful lesson. It shows us that the engineering challenges from initial containment to permanent structure cannot be separated from ethical and collaborative responsibilities.